It's mostly going to be about strategy and what to do when you don't know anything, or how to, for example, win from a closing half, or how to find arguments. So it's going to cover a wide range of topics. But before I start, I just want to get a feeling of the room. Like, is there anyone who just started debate this year? Okay. And is there anyone who doesn't know anything about debate, that they are completely new? No, it's no worries. Okay, then the rest has more than 1 year experience, right? Okay. 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 And you guys attended competitions, I presume, like in debate competitions, right? Okay, good. If there is anything at some point you don't understand, you don't know, just please feel free to ask. And I just want this workshop to be interactive, and I wanted to obviously contribute. So obviously, whenever you feel like there's something going on and you don't know what's happening, just feel free to ask. Okay, let's begin. Today's agenda is, first of all, how to prep in general. So the preparation, like during 15 minutes when you receive the motion, what you should be doing. The second point I will be covering is what to do when you don't know anything about the motion. You are completely lost. What's happening? I don't know this country. I don't know these people. But I have to do. Third is choosing a strategy. That's a general, like what you should do in case you receive a motion, and there are multiple ways of approaching that, tackling that motion. Fourth point will be the prioritization, because although there is a motion and you have so many ideas, some of the ideas will be better than the other ideas. So how can you prioritize that? And last point will be how to win from the closing half. Basically, those 5 topics I think is a good introduction in terms of the strategy and in terms of you preparing for this tournament and also for the upcoming tournaments and debate in general. All right. Let's start with the first. So how to prep in general. So the main idea is, obviously, you should always think what the judges want from you when you receive a motion. And you should also try to say, if you're, for example, in the government side, let's assume you're opening government, it's not enough that you would say arguments from your own side, but you should also somehow foresee what the opposition will say as against you, and then prepare that and prepare answer to that. For example, if you were to have the motion, this house would pay reparations to women. Does anyone have an idea what the debate is about, or what you would run from opening government?
There was once a class that was heavily discriminated, and now we need to give them that equal social balance so they can qualify and reach the same values as a man.
Yeah, that's very good. That's correct. You would probably try to explain that women, for example, suffered due to patriarchy over the centuries. They didn't have their rights. They couldn't, for example, get the right to divorce or right to have the property or whatsoever. And because of that, they are in this situation today. And if they pay reparations, then they would probably use this money to make themselves better. Here, there's a very important thing. So do you think an opposition team would come and say, no, patriarchy didn't exist? Probably not, right? They wouldn't say women didn't suffer, right? So strategically, it is, although it sounds like you have to convince the judges that why patriarchy existed and why it harmed women, if you spend so much time, you're actually wasting your speech. Because no opposition team will come there, no, that's not true. Obviously, you want to give a context, you want to make an introduction in the side of government, but you want to make sure that this is very limited. So this is probably just about characterization or just a little bit reasons, maybe a couple of sentences or a couple of examples, but that's it. If you were to be the prime minister in this debate and spend half of your speech on that, it's just not good, because you could have spent that time on something else that the opposition is actually going to disagree. So what is opposition going to tell here? For example, they are going to say this money won't necessarily help them, or this money could be used in other areas, or there will be backlash from people because you're giving them, obviously you're probably using some taxpayers' money, or you're using somehow the money that exists, because it obviously doesn't come from the air. So focusing on those, practical implications, or what kind of world it would create, or how it would achieve its aims would be strategically something better to do. Yeah? Is that clear? Any questions? Comments? Okay. Let's look at the second example. I think this is a very interesting debate, very hypothetical debate, obviously. So this house prefers living in a world where people do not have any memory of people after they die. So let's say your mother, for example, or your parents, they die, and then you have no memory of them after they die. So take a couple of seconds and try to think about it, what kind of world it would be. Okay. Now think about your opening government. What would the opposition could say about these worlds?
It values the existence of those people and the people who have also memory.
Sorry, could you?
The things that those people who have died brought into the world and devaluing their whole existence.
Mm-hmm. And why is this bad?
It's bad.
Okay, we'll come back to it.
Okay.
Any other ideas?
It's important for people to have the memories about their parents or their any other people.
Why?
Because they love them and also they used to live with them, so it's really hard to work out.
Okay. Yes.
Maybe they have models of their families, and when some parts of this just crash, and they have destructive, and then we just implement their models to our life. And in the future, we maybe have not just normal life with a woman and husband, and then it couldn't be normal for them.
Okay.
Well, as an opposition leader, I would ask about the mechanism. I mean, do we forget about the person's name or about their deeds or whatever? Because that's pretty important. If we forget about the deeds, then we have no source to learn and to make to fix mistakes more than before. And if we don't forget names, then it's bad because we need to attribute the mistakes to someone in order to make ourselves familiar with them.
Yes, so that's I think is a very good point. So what kind of world will this be? Because according to your definition, what you forget, obviously the debate is going to move to a different direction. If you're just going to forget their names, then or that your memories about them, then it's one thing. Or but if you're just going to remember somehow what you learned, but it won't be associated with them, then it's something else, right? So you have to kind of make it at least a clarification on the side of government. What would it look like? Okay.
Still on the side of opposition, you can say, for example, people won't be having so much motivation, right? Motivation to do things in general, to open something new, because there won't be their names in the history. Why should I bother creating new chemical elements or doing something that will change the course of history if I won't remember it anyway?
Okay, that's a very good point as well. But here you have an assumption that people only do those things because they want to be remembered, like for the selfish reasons. There could also be people who are doing it just for altruistic reasons. So I think while doing this point, you need to probably specify why majority of the people have selfish reasons to actually take these positions. But apart from that, that's a very good point. Any other comment? Yes?
Because in order to value life, we need to remember and accept death. And aside from that, people who have lived before us have created the society we live in today.
Yes.
It's their experience, their mistakes, their sacrifices that will brought us here. And if we forget that, we will stop evolving. And non progredi est regredi. So we will simply forget a lot of things, we will lose ourselves. We will keep repeating the same mistakes.
So basically you're saying that the history won't be there anymore.
Yes.
Alright, and why is history is important? Because for your future you improve yourself, you make yourself better, you take lessons from history. What could you say, for example, this is obviously a very important point from the opposition, right? There won't be any history. Obviously this sounds really horrible. What would you say from the side of proposition to be able to tackle that? Yes.
people still learn fast and learn from mistakes.
Mhm.
So probably, let's say, any pupil that read the history of some historical period won't learn that much from this, as he will learn from his own experience.
Yeah.
For example, when he becomes a president, he'll still be making these mistakes, whether he knows history or he doesn't.
Okay.
So this doesn't make any difference. And still, we can say that history is a science in general because it's hard to prove whether these actions were like that exactly the way they were not rewritten, and stuff like that.
Yeah, that is like one of the points that you could say that there is an alternative way of learning and improving yourself, which is basically your own experiences.
I've thought about this more from a psychological point of view from the scientific position. Like there's a group of people for whom the death of their loved ones or the ones who are close to them is very desperate, and they feel really bad and traumatized after learning about the death, and thinking about the person actually makes them suffer. So if we prove that they actually do suffer and this suffering is really great, we can actually use this suffering and this motion as the key to stop the suffering and make this person to move on.
That's correct. But this is a separate point, probably, right? Like this is doesn't necessarily answer the history point, but rather say even though there are some benefits that you may have from having a memory of a dead person, it causes so much trouble on the individual, and then you make a trade-off why one is more important than the other. But coming back to the history again, what else would you say in order to tackle this point, apart from the personal experience and then able to be learn through personal experiences? Because opposition has this assumption that history by itself is good, right? Like just because there is history automatically means it's good outcomes. But does it have to be that way? Yes.
This might be not structuralized for what I'm going to say right now. Like basically, when we have a history, we don't actually we remember the people, but not accurately the ideas that those people brought to the world. So for example, we might have ideas which are quite neutral and might be given in a good light to solve some situations that happen right now, but we view them as ideas that are automatically bad because the person who provided them is perceived by us as a bad person or somebody who did not do really good things with this great idea in his time, hence the illusion in the society's perspective that the idea or the ideology is automatically bad.
Yeah, that's a very good point as well. Like, it's obviously, if the history is always associated with certain people and individuals, sometimes you lose out potential benefit just because the person was a horrible person. That's also very good point.
Can also work the same to tackle the government's point of history, but in a different way, as you told us. So basically, we could say that these ideas are followed because they think that those historical personalities were actually doing nothing wrong. For example, they maybe don't like the ideas of communism, but they think that Lenin was a good person. In general, it was a nice politics, so they follow the idea of communism, which is not that the opposite of that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you could probably answer to many of the points that could be tackled one way or any other. And there is, for example, another part that you could probably think about the history. Like, try to be more strategic, because judges obviously like those kind of things. And if you, for example, portray the history in a way that it always represents one group over another, and portrays one as a more dominant and strong and powerful compared to other groups, that's probably not representative, right? For example, women in history. Obviously, they're not portrayed as men, right? They were not given the opportunity to write the history even in the first place. Or minorities, or people who are living in that country are not belong to the majority group. They are never being represented, right? So generally, the history, for example, in the United States, will be about the white men. It won't be about the indigenous people living there. It won't be necessarily about LGBT people or African American people or their struggles, but rather the dominant group. And from that perspective, even though you conceive the fact that the history won't exist anymore, you basically dramatically decrease their benefits by portraying it and characterizing it in this way. So that's another way of looking these kind of points. Even though it looks like so important, oh my God, history, I need to know what is happening in my past, it's not necessarily helpful or representative to everyone, and it doesn't necessarily make the future better, because what you learn is obviously biased in one way or another. Yeah? Okay. Any comments, questions? No? Alright, let's go to the next. When you don't know anything. So I love this topic because there are a lot of things that people don't know. And one way or another, whatever you read, how much you study, there will always be one topic that you are not so comfortable about. Because CA teams are coming from different geographies, different backgrounds, they all have their own studies, their own knowledge. So you will always have one or another thing that you are not very comfortable with. Then in that situation, what to do? So the first thing, I'm going to go through the examples because I think it's better to focus on the examples than what you can do and then apply to the other areas. For example, this is my own personal, it happened to me, that I was in Croatia, and in Croatia there was basically a motion that Croatia shouldn't celebrate this day of victory. And there is also a little bit info slide that what happened in this day, why they are celebrating, blah, 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 but quite limited. And I don't know much about Croatian politics. I don't even know who is their prime minister or their political parties, because it's not like I cannot know everything, right? But there are certain things that you can presume about this. So, first of all, what does this motion is focusing? Firstly, Croatia. Okay, when I hear Croatia, okay, there must be something with the Balkans, Yugoslavia, Serbia, there was like some conflict there, I guess, in the 90s, something happened, so it's bad, like, okay, let's put it aside. The second thing, what do I read? It's Day of Victory. So there is a commemoration, like people probably going on the streets, there are so many flags, there are songs, there are emotions, they are parading, the politicians probably like talking on the TV, people are singing, but probably there are also people living in these countries who don't belong to the majority. There are probably minorities, and they're probably like, oh, what's happening? Why? Like, they're probably feeling a bit threatened, they probably doesn't feel like this is right, or maybe neighboring countries. Maybe they feel like this Croatia, this whole victory day, the way they are celebrating, it's not, that's not how the history happened, according to me. Why are they celebrating, for example, right? So there are things that you could probably deduct from this motion without actually knowing anything. Because CA teams wouldn't have given this motion if there was no, for example, a person who is not happy with this. They wouldn't give this motion if there was no discussion about this, right? Like, always try to approach from that perspective. There should be a debate. There are probably minorities. There are probably people who are oppressed. There are probably people who are right-wing ideologies and using these to basically extend their agendas, and then try to make arguments. Then, again, nothing specific, but look at it. Especially focus on the victory day. What kind of day this would be, right? This whole emotions, these flags, the songs, it's probably realistic. I don't have to go to Croatia or to the day to actually expect that, because more or less every country has their own victory days, right? You probably have a victory day in Ukraine. And then you can imagine how it looks like, and you can just apply it and assume it's more or less the same. Correct? Excuse me?
I mean, is there even a victory day in Ukraine? 9th of May. Yeah, seriously,
We have independence.
Yes. Independence is a way of victory, probably, right? But you know that there are always these nations, every nation has their own celebration of their independence or their victory over a war or something like that. And basically, more or less, all these countries have similar way of celebrating it. And here you can focus on this emotional aspect of it and how, for example, it is either good or bad people to be emotional about politics in this way. And then have some arguments from that. And here you don't have to know anything. You just have to say, this is a human behavior that will result in this way, because here are the things. And then just say, yeah, in Croatia. Does that make sense?
I just have a question.
Yes.
If we can conduct of the day of victory is by our common knowledge, but it doesn't necessarily will be the same for Croatians who actually have the celebration of this day. So how just to make sure that our argument, the psychological argument that we're giving about Croatians, won't fall flat because we won't perceive them or argument in the correct direction.
Why are you not perceiving the correct direction?
Because we're presuming the Croatians are thinking a certain way, which they might not.
Okay.
Because if we don't know why they're celebrating the victory of what it is, and so on and so on, how can we be so sure that they perceive it exactly the way that we give it?
Well, I mean, I think the best thing to always have a common sense, in the sense that, does that sound realistic to me? The thing is, judges are more likely not to be Croats themselves, right? I mean, even if they are, or even if they have some kind of knowledge, they cannot expect that knowledge from you. So I think the best thing would be to try to be more, as much as strategic as possible, and try to engage with the other teams as much as possible, but not on the examples, but rather on the logic. Because examples by itself won't be necessarily winning you the debate in the first place, right? So in that sense, the more generalizations you can make, the better. Hence, I think it won't be a problem, even though it's not maybe exactly how it would look like. I think in the majority of the debates, we get away with a little bit being superficial, or a little bit not being, for example, imagine you're discussing a Turkey debate. Obviously, I know a lot, I know super much, but I wouldn't expect any debaters to know as much, and I wouldn't necessarily punish them as much, as long as it makes sense, and as long as it's logical, and it answers or has the debate, and winning that arguments, then it's fine. Okay, the second motion. So, Iran. This house, as Iran, would seize all support for military groups in the Middle East. Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, etc. This was a motion in the world, last year. I mean, it's obviously more or less, we know a little bit about Middle East, right? About Iran, that there was, for example, sanctions because they were developing their nuclear weapons, and the sanctions lifted, and then it came back. So there's still a little bit problems, probably, for Iran, right? We would know that. In Middle East, we know that there are conflicts, there are different countries, and they don't necessarily like all each other. We don't necessarily know all the allies and which countries where and who is Iran's neighbors and everything. We just need to know generally. So, what do we know about Iran? In terms of their ethnic composition. They have two major groups. Which one is dominant?
Persians.
Excuse me?
The Persians.
Yes. And what kind of religious background they have?
They are both Muslims, but there are Shiite Muslims
Yes.
and Sunni Muslims.
Yes. And who is in the majority?
Shiite Muslims.
Correct. Does everyone know this? No? Okay, this would be good to know. Now you know. I think, obviously you cannot know every country, but Iran is one of those countries in the region which is quite important, and it's one of the countries where Shias are in the majority. So I think that example to know is very good. And let's look at the other countries in the Middle East. Who else is a big power in the Middle East?
Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
They're all Sunni.
They're all?
Sunni.
They're all Sunni. Okay, interesting. All right. Let's keep that away. So now let's look at these groups. Hezbollah. What do we know about them? I don't know much.
It's a military organization.
Yeah, I mean, they're terrorists, probably. I mean,
Yes.
the motion says that.
Hezbollah is a terrorist organization.
Yes.
They have radical beliefs and they fight them with weapons and stuff.
Yeah, they are a terrorist organization, and if I know their ethnicities, their religious affiliations, maybe it would help me. Do I know that?
Not exactly, because none of official religion takes them. Because they go against the belief, they go against the Quran, and they promote violence, which is not suitable for the majority of people. They do not accept it, they do not want to follow it.
Yes. So is an explanation that they are mostly Shia, but it doesn't have to be the case. Okay? That's not going to matter that much. Anyway, let's look at Hamas. What do we know about Hamas? More. I like that. What do we know? They're also terrorist organization. Yes. And what is their religious association? Excuse me?
War in Palestine?
Yes, but are they Sunni or Shia?
As far as I know.
But they're in Palestine. Are Palestinians Shia or Sunni? Okay, then?
I don't really think that the religious association is the most important thing in Hamas. Like, this is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which they are involved in. So I think that's why.
Yeah, sure. Just let's lastly look at the Houthis.
Yeah, more radical one.
Yes. So as you can see, these examples doesn't necessitate for you to focus on a certain religious sect, right? Because you have multiple of them. So obviously this is not necessarily about that part of it. So it's more generally using military organizations and violence and this kind of politics to either support certain countries or destabilize certain countries, right? So we established that. Okay, now coming back to the Iran and Saudi Arabia and all the other regional players. So what do I know? Iran and Saudi Arabia, they don't get along well. I know that, right? Okay. And then I know some other things too. Saudi Arabia, they just had a new prince. Clark, do we know that?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Some. So there's this new prince. Probably I could get away with saying that, look, this new prince is different than the old ones, right? I mean, it's very logical that there's someone coming to the power, they want to prove themselves, they're young, they're probably a bit different. But in which way? Now here comes your debating ability. Either they are more moderate, they're more liberal, they give the right to drive to women, look at them, they're so good. Or they are a bit aggressive. Look at Yemen, they're starting a war or something like that. You can think about yourself or think about examples or try to make something from the things you might remember from newspapers or from the things that you heard, and then try to make a conclusion out of it that belongs to your side, basically, whether you're proposition and opposition, right? And then from that perspective, if Iran should stop doing that, because one reason that they're using this terrorist organization is to basically fight against Saudi Arabia or try to have their own hegemony in the region, right? Try to have their power. And then try to show off that this either will be effective or won't be effective. And let's say you're on the side of government. What would be the alternative? For example, if Iran, and this is an actor's motion, so I am deciding this as Iran, if I stop doing this, if I stop supporting these groups, what would I do instead? What is logical?
We'll try to go in a more diplomatic way and try to speak with the prince to gain peace between the nations.
Okay, that's very good. What else? Oppose those many groups. That's one of the options as well, sure. But when you support a military group, what do you give them?
The resources.
Resources.
So money and weapons.
Exactly. What would I do with this money and weapons now?
They will go inside the country and help infrastructure.
Yes. And why is this good?
Because our people will be more happy in terms of, I don't know, some people will be able to get a car, they'll have no food, they can have, I don't know, healthier kids, and so on, so on, so on. So basically we're directing the money flow from the war to our own people, which is automatically better because they're our own people,
yes.
Where the government cares about its people, and
yes.
so on, so on.
Exactly. See, that's very simple. Obviously, I need to spend some money to support these groups. Now that money stays at home. And why is this good? People are fed, people are sent to, I don't know, university, people get some social services, and they get better. And why is this good? Because Iran, for example, wants to be stable. They want for Iran to support these groups. And now coming back to the Saudi Arabia topic. So if I, on the side of government, if I say that Saudi Arabia is getting more liberal, they are getting better, look at the new prince, then I can also maybe get away with saying that, look, they don't want to fight with us anymore, so let's stop supporting these groups. Let's be nice, let's be diplomatic. And we have so much we can share, like the trade, like all those things, it's in their interest. Stuff like that, right? Or we can say that Saudi Arabia already is fighting these wars, or they're having public pressure from, Yemen and all those things, so they don't want to start another one with Iran. Stuff like that. So you can always try to connect certain things that you may somehow deduce or claim or reasonably expect, and then use them in your own event. Okay? Any questions, comments?
Actually,
yes.
I have a question on how would you make a counter-argument to that, because if it wasn't for Iran being the actor, like you could have said, oh, there is no guarantee.
Right? Like, why is this bad? Because you give them money, you give them resources, the guns, they kill people, it's not good. Why? Okay, that's bad. But secondly, they could also one day attack you. You have no way of controlling that. And there are so many examples of that happening, right? In Afghanistan, for example, with the United States and Hezbollah and all those things. That's why, for example, you can say that this is by itself is good, and then just put the word Iran and put the word those groups. Like, you could claim that. And why is it good without knowing anything? Why, for a country, it's good to have such a thing? As we said previously, you could use it as a negotiation tool, power. Look, United States, give me this, then I'm going to control these groups, I'm going to make sure they're not getting this. So you can use it as a horse trading and as a negotiation chip in the international area, and it will probably actually more effective than diplomacy. For example, you could claim that, and stuff like that. Okay? All right. Now, last motion. So we've been everywhere in the region, more or less. So Italy. So Italy had a referendum. Have you heard about it? No? No problem. I mean, the motion says there was a referendum, so you have to believe it. And they should have voted yes in the referendum. And the way the motion says, that means they voted no. Right? Okay, very easy. So far, so good. And then there's an info slide, what the referendum is about. One point is reducing the number of members of the parliament. Another point is having only one house to pass laws. I don't know what that means, but that means there is no one house, there are maybe 2 or 3. But there is not one place where you just vote and pass, but maybe there are 2 places. Like maybe similar to US, or like there's a Senate and there's a Congress, or it's like maybe something like that. But it's not like one place. Okay, I know that. Plus, and giving less powers to regional governments. What does that mean? They have more power. Right now, they will have less. Yes, more centralized. Okay? Okay, before going into these details, what do I know about Italy?
They have a financial crisis.
They have financial crisis. Very good. What else do I know?
Migrants.
Migrants. What else do I know?
North of Italy is richer than the south.
Very good. North is rich, south is less rich. What else?
But south,
So,
Italy has problem with mafia.
sorry?
With mafia.
They have problems with mafia. That's very good.
They are divided into different provinces. Each of the provinces have their own dialects, and they are very different.
Yeah, so there is not unified like one country, but there are different regions, dialects, there are different interests maybe. What else do I know? Let's also think about economics. Corruption.
We can talk about it, but it exists.
Yes. Okay, corruption, mafia, they probably go hand in hand. What else?
Unemployment.
Excuse me? Unemployment, yes. What else? Think more about the industries. Like, what do they get money from? Tourism, where? Very good. What else is there? In the north, what do they have?
Grapes.
Excuse me?
Wine.
Grapes. Okay. Okay. Sure, yes. They do have wines. What else? Please join. Do you know what's happening in Milan? Milan. Like Milan. It's a business. What kind of business? Fashion business, very good. Anything else?
All kinds of business.
All kinds of business, but there is obviously some leading businesses compared to others. The reason I'm asking this is just going to make it easier than for you to make arguments later on. Excuse me? Cars. Very good. Exactly. So I think we have a really good, like, how can I say, like the fundamentals. Like we know a lot actually about Italy. No? Even though you thought, Italy, what would this be about? But we know a lot. We know about its economics, we know about its politics, we know about the situation with the Euro crisis, there's refugees, there's migrants, there's unemployment. Yeah? And the government keeps changing somehow. Like, I don't know who the prime minister is, it keeps changing, right? That's also something we know? Okay. Then let's go through these points, which InfoSlide already gave us. So one of the things about the referenda was that these 3 points, and they are a bit different from each other. Would you agree? Like, obviously they are about politics, they are about governance and stuff like that, but they are like, I wish there was a single referenda for each. Why there are like 3?
Because they're connected.
Excuse me?
Because they are connected.
They are connected, yes. But also you could say, like this is also one way of looking at it, also you could say they are not as connected. Maybe you may be okay with one, but you may not be okay with 2. Right? So even from that perspective, you can say, look, this referenda, and the reason why, if you're in the opposition, for example, that even though some points may be legitimate or useful, that they were all bundled together, they were all like asking like many questions, and the way it's asked always also matters, and because of that, that was also one reason that people didn't vote in that direction. Yeah? You can make this characterization something like that. Or in the government, you can say, no, these are interconnected, and there's actually a logic there, and this is the logic that we are trying to reach. That's just a very simple comment. Now coming back to these 3 points. So, reducing the number of members of parliament. I don't have to know how much. I don't have to know what it should be. Let's assume they were 500, now they will make 300 people. Why is this good?
It saves a little money.
Saves money. Okay, what else?
Less people to govern, less some disagreements.
Yeah, decisions
Decisions are made faster.
Okay, decisions are made faster. But by itself, this could be good, this could be bad. Obviously, I can give you examples where you need fast decisions, or where I can give you examples fast decisions was so dangerous. Right? Okay. Which of those, remember in the beginning we talked about like many points that we know about Italy. Where can I connect these fast decisions to one of those and have an actually benefit to myself? Like where do I need fast decisions? And less noise, less discussion. Like I need to act quickly.
Why do you ask me?
Excuse me?
So what was the question?
The question is, why do I need fast decisions?
Well, because all of the bad stuff we just discussed, like crises and different ways, like migration crisis, economic crisis, do something about that without hesitation and probably.
Okay, you could say that we would be able to solve or tackle the refugee crisis faster. Like we could pass certain policies and we can act faster, and this is good. What else you could say? Again, still the same topic. Governments. Like we talked about this north and south difference. Yeah, there must be something that these regional governments do differently, maybe, and that is right now causing some tension.
It's like trying to unify both sides and make a wholesome, peaceful.
Yes. So I would expect, for example, we said North is richer, right? They have these like automobile industries or like fashion, fancy, they have big companies, banks. And then in the South, what do they have? Tourism and agriculture. Like obviously they are both sectors obviously very valid, but probably one brings more money than the other. Probably one is less seasonal, less subject to the weather, and it's more probably constant, right? And that means probably North is richer. Like, yes.
Government controls all the money, and divide.
Exactly. Now we can take the money, because not right now in the status quo, the North didn't want to give their money because they had their regional power and they have the authority. And the South, they didn't have as much money and they couldn't claim so. But if you have more centralized government, that means you can allocate resources much easier. Why is this good?
Because we're trying to pour out poorness.
Yes.
By giving them better jobs, making
Yes.
their life easier.
Yes. Those are true. And they are very correct, and you should probably say those. But also you probably want to say something like, what is in it for the whole country? Why is this good for the whole country?
Because there's no financial imbalance in the social groups.
Yes, why is this bad?
It is bad because...
Any ideas? Yes.
Maybe it causes inequality or something.
Yes, it causes inequality. And why is this bad?
Inequality causes some
Why is inequality bad?
Look, don't think about like why is inequality bad for people. I mean, obviously if you have less money, it's bad. Like, I think everyone can empathize with that. But there is a further things that is happening down the line when there is an inequality.
Yeah, the people start to divide.
Yes, why?
They are finding things like money in Spain, so there are different problems there. But for example, they are richer, so we don't need them that much. We can govern ourselves, so we can have more power ourselves. For example, some people in Italy can divide into countries because they are two different financial plan, and there will be differences in major consequences. Develop like different cultures.
Okay, so this is a very good idea, but it needs to come with a warning, because obviously saying that, look, Italy will be split into two is quite difficult to prove. Like, if I hear it, I'm like, really? Why? Like, you probably have to prove a lot that's to happen, because not every country where there is inequality splits into two, right? So, but the idea, initial start point, I think is correct. Like, people will be angry probably. Like, why do they get to be rich and I get to be poor just because I live in the South? Then they probably have grievances. They probably support certain political ideologies or certain political groups that is not in the interest of whole Italy, right? They are probably maybe more populist, more conservative, but in the sense that it wants to blame maybe refugees for their problems, or more like minorities or migrants, right? So you could connect those inequality points to these, and then show the whole country will suffer from this, and that's why the North should give their money to the South. Because if you have much more populist policies, probably the people in the North will be harmed from that one way or another. I mean, you could claim those at least, right?
We have a slight case of Korea.
Korea.
And a slight case of it, so we have two governments, right?
Yeah.
In that case, if we have more constitutional governments, they will try to ignore them. Raising their power because they have money and they don't need to share with South. South will create their government, making it more powerful, saying that we don't need those noble people to help us, we will help ourselves. In some way we will build the communism again. And in general we'll maybe not have two countries, but we will be having a slight case of that. And those differences will cause such inequality and lead to bad consequences.
Yes, obviously you could claim there will be two different types of governance, and this is going to create certain tensions and the problems. Yes?
Inequality could lead to hate, and from not hate, it could go even further to things like the riots, and in the most critic way, the civil war, which would be planned.
But again, it needs to come with a warning. Like, although the initial idea is probably correct, for you to prove this in 7 minutes, it's probably unlikely. You can't probably say that just because of this there will be civil war, right? But be careful where you're connecting those things, because it needs to be reasonable without so much work required that to be proven. Like, if you always go to the most extreme things, because that's just inherently somehow people like debaters, like I want to show the worst impacts, like the worst thing that could happen, because that's going to make me win the debate. But that's not necessarily the case, because it comes with a cost. It comes with that you need to probably spend much more time on this, and it's probably not likely. Like just because something is possible doesn't mean it's probable, right? You want to show that in most of the cases, this is how it's going to end, because that's just how things work. For example, if you have inequality, then grievances. Then I can easily explain that. And I can say that there will be tension. But I cannot automatically say that there will be civil war, because it requires so many other things to exist for that to happen. And that's why I say it should come with a warning, that you should be careful not to exaggerate the harms or the benefits. So that's very, very important. Okay? All right. Let's move on. Is there any questions?
Just one.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask an example that was brought to my mind from the side of the opposition, because we have Greece that is in quite a similar situation to speak about migrants and economics. And there is this one house in there, called Dawn, that is already came into power, and which we see is already gained influence in the European Parliament, which is, and it's basically a neo-Nazist party, and you can drive the negative consequences from there. Can we possibly say that because the situations in both the countries are similar, if we give one house power, it might bring us to a similar situation?
I think you could. You could say that, let's look at Italy's past. There is, someone in power who wasn't so good. Do we know? Interesting, yes. So, we know him, right? He wasn't the best person to maybe the governor. I don't know. And you could claim that he, for example, did certain things that abused his, for example, power with his connections to the media or something like that. You could always claim those things, because that's generally how it is when you have a more powerful government or a leader. They probably try to gain control of the other things in the country, like the economy, the media, and everything. So you could claim that. So it could create such a situation where one gains so much power, and that power in the side of government is used for the good, right? We pass policies that helps our people, we pass certain kind of things that is going to make sure the refugees or migrants are better, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? It could also be used in a negative way. So you could definitely use those in the opposition. Okay, any other questions and comments? No. Okay, are we good? Yeah? Okay, let's move on. Choosing a strategy. So what does that mean? The word even strategy is I have to do things, I have to think about things. Okay, let's go. So if before the debate, you could make a strategy. When I say before the debate, it means before the actual speeches begin. During your 15 minutes of preparation, sometimes you have to decide on the strategy. For example, the motion. This House believes that we have no moral obligation for future generations. Let that sink in. Think about it. What does that mean? No moral obligation for future generations. Okay. So, this debate is probably about current generation versus the future generation, right? They probably have a conflict of interest in, yes, and that conflict of interest is basically begs this question: that do we have a moral obligation to the future generation or not, right? So, what this conflict of interest might be?
Ecological.
Yes, ecological. In one side, obviously, you would try to improve the environment, try to make sure that the future generations have clean water, air, and the forests and nice things that we like about the earth. But it probably comes with a cost, right? In order to do this, you probably need to do what?
To preserve it.
Yes. And how would you preserve it?
We need to change the methods of creating products. We need to change the industry. We need to control the expansion of the buildings, for example.
Yes.
Basically, we're putting resources in status quo.
Exactly. Like if you want to, for example, save a forest, you probably direct some resources there, like maybe the animals or the biodiversity, or you want to make sure that water is clean. You probably transfer some of your resources. But what else? What else would you need to do?
We need to control the birth rate.
You need to control the birth rate. Interesting.
Because the higher the birth rate, the lower is the number of workplaces they will have in the future, and the more resources they will consume. Therefore, the poverty will grow.
Okay. All right. That could be, yes. I can see that could be used. What else? Like, for example, there are some industries. They probably create some harms, like, for example, mining or coal or just factories, right? If factories, for example, have to run on green technology so that they can create, like, harm environment less, that probably costs more for you to open this factory, right? That means you probably spend, as a business owner, much more your money on these kind of things, rather than making your factory bigger or employing more people or giving them more wages. Obviously, the assumption is that they will distribute that money there, but we have to make some assumptions, right? Okay, so here, basically, the debate is about that. Like, there is obviously conflict of interest. We want things right now, and future generations want things other. So here, I have multiple strategies. One, I could show that current generation is more important than the future generation. Correct? How could I do that? It needs to be a little bit philosophical.
There will be no future generation if we want to provide the status quo generation with enough resources. A bit far-fetched, but you know where I'm going at.
Yes, but do you really think we would cease to exist if we...
Yeah, a bit far-fetched, sorry.
It's a bit unlikely, right?
But it's like the only thing we know is our existence. Like there is nothing beyond there is nothing but our existence.
I love this. Exactly. Like you try to, for example, put a philosophical view. Like only thing that I can know is that I exist. And therefore the moral obligation can only exist to the things I know. Like you could claim this philosophical argument, right?
You cannot control it further after I die, so I rather not.
Yeah, you could also claim selfish reasons, that I need to prioritize myself. I don't have to care about others. What else?
That there are no guarantees that the future generation will take care about us. Will take care of us, will provide us with the resources.
If they live at the same time, yes.
There are no guarantees that they will try to provide education for the rest of us.
Yeah.
So we can invest ourselves, we can spend our time, our resources in the future generation, and get nothing in return.
Okay, yes. What else? Like here, like you can always be creative because no one gives you these philosophical things. Either you have to have an interest, like read those kind of things, or study philosophy, or just be creative. These are your options. There is a very interesting word in this motion. It doesn't say less moral obligations. It says no moral obligations. You always see the difference, right? Like you have no moral obligations to future generations. So another strategy, you could claim there are no moral obligations in the first place. Let it sink. Let it sink in. Like I have no moral obligations.
So my son just turned 16 and I do what I want.
No, not exactly that. Okay.
I do not know what the next generation will be like, hence I cannot presume they will try to save the things and have the same values as we did.
But if they were, then you concede the fact that there is moral obligation.
Yes.
It's like there is nothing to do out of the sense of obligation. Everything we do is like to pleasure ourselves. Like even if we choose to help this generation, like it's because it makes us feel good in the course of our existence. So like
there is no concept of obligation. Nobody does anything out of this kind of obligation.
Yes, there is further. Like that's very good, but there's even further than that. It's very crazy, but bear with me. You could say there is no moral obligation, because in order to have a moral obligation, you have to have free will. And there is no free will. And then you can prove that. I mean, the things...
want to do that, and you don't.
Yeah, I mean, you can say that, look, there is no free will. Without free will, and obviously you have to prove that. Without free will, there is no moral obligation. They cannot exist. And without these moral obligations, since we have no, then we also categorically don't have any moral obligations to future generation. Like that's one of the strategies, right? Because let's leave this debate and go to another debate. Let's assume this debate that this house, as the Baltic countries, would have conscription, like forced military, right? And I could say, conscription is bad by itself. I don't have to talk about Baltic countries. I don't have to talk about Russia. I could just say this is by itself categorically a bad thing. And then further along my speech, I could say that why specifically it is bad for Baltic countries and their politics. But before that, I can just make this general philosophical argument. That's basically the same thing. Coming back to this motion, I could claim first, there is no moral obligations in the first place, let alone for future generations. And that opposition now have to do something that they never thought about in the 15 minutes. They have to prove there is free will. And that's not easy. Like, try to do it. Like, on the spot. No, you can't. Like, you have to really think about these kind of things before. So that's why these kind of strategical decisions before the debate could help you win the debates in a different way. It makes it maybe even more fun and more interesting. Yeah? How does that feel? Interesting. I would say that too. Yeah, it's fun. But obviously try to be reasonable. You cannot always do those kind of things, right? Like it needs to fit into the debate and the wording and the motion. Like you have to be smart about it. Yeah? Okay. Then during the debate. So you can also have different strategies during the debate because sometimes debates go in one direction and you expected the opposite. Or you have no idea what's happening in this debate and you're like closing half. And they just, for example, said completely different. And then if you run your own arguments, you're going to contradict. And you shouldn't, for example, contradict your own side, right? Stuff like that. So let's look at one. This house would create Amsterdams in areas with high drug usage. So, and there's an info slide. What Amsterdam is, it's basically, similar to Amsterdam, you have coffee shops where you can consume marijuana if you're above 18, in, licensed places, blah, blah, blah. Yeah? And then you have this debate, and then obviously opening government tells you why it's good, it's going to decrease basically the harmful effects of the drug usage, this is something we cannot solve, we should create these in these specific areas, and yada yada yada, like something you expect. But then, maybe opening opposition comes and says, you know what, we legalized weed, counter-prop. Because you would expect them to say, no, we shouldn't create this Amsterdam, use drugs, they are bad, but they could come and say, no, let's make it legal everywhere. And then you are closing opposition, you're like, okay, this is interesting. And then throw away all your arguments, because your arguments was about why basically you wanna, weed is bad, drugs are bad, and how harmful effects it has, and then you have to decide at that point what to do. And then, for example, in the opening half, there is so much discussion. Whether the discussion is not about whether it should be legalized or not, but whether it should be legalized in a small scale or a big scale, which is a complete different discussion than what you expect. Then you have to adjust yourself, right? Here, the strategy, you have to change your strategy, and you have to have the confidence to throw away everything you have and just try to make that debate, take it, and try to play along with that debate. Does that make sense? And how would you do that? Excuse me?
We now need to do that.
Now, yes. I mean, yeah. Like, you're closing opposition. Opening opposition told everything about the problems in the opening government's case, why, for example, if it's in the small areas, why it's, for example, creates certain harms, right? Like, therefore, it should be better off if we legalize it everywhere, everyone has access to it.
But then I think maybe we should be sending a message that this is something exceptional, this is an exceptional measure, and we have to not normalize it by making it global and say, we're doing it because we want everyone to have whatever pleasures they want, even if they're bad for them.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's just a remedy for a particular problem in those areas. And if we don't make it clear, like we're sending a completely different message, we're not solving this problem.
Mm-hmm.
This is still, this becomes something like nice and like bougie to do, but
Yeah.
like, you still have this other level of drug usage that is still not nice and liberal and
Yeah, that's definitely one way of looking at it.
I have an idea. Like, we can take this statement of the opening position that drugs are bad and give it another perspective. Like, we understand that some people take drugs and like we're okay with it if it's marijuana and it's not like very heavy drugs.
Mm-hmm.
But if we have a high drug usage, that means that even a moderate drug can alter one's mind and psychic health so much that this person actually does more harm to himself. And if we have such kind of a situation and we're doing the Amsterdam thing, then basically we are giving them the legal right to self-destruct themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So and we're giving the alternative that we should not use the Amsterdam strategy, but rather work with decreasing the high drug usage.
Mm-hmm.
Does that work?
How do you connect that to the counter-prop that you heard before?
We're still saying that drugs are bad, but in a specific way.
But the opening opposition doesn't say drugs are bad. They say, no, they're good. That's why we should legalize it instead of just creating small areas. Like, opening government makes a case. For example, I don't know, obviously, the regions here, but let's assume there is one region, like in Lviv, one area, like a park, I don't know, or a commercial area, or outside of the city. Let's imagine Lviv suburbs. There is one street, and only they are allowed to open shops and sell drugs there. Rest of the Lviv, it's not. So that's opening government's case. And opening opposition says, no, it should be everywhere.
What would the government say? This is quite logical for me that if we allow, for example, the areas with high drug usage to create abstinence, then what is an area with a high drug usage? So, for example, if they do heavy drugs, they probably won't be interested in coffee shops with marijuana. If there is just everyone is smoking weed in there, then okay, it's fine, it works probably. But it depends a lot on what the government will say about this abstinence. How would they help? For example, government says that a forbidden fruit is more sweet, sweeter, and if we create abstinence, then we will lower the drug usage. And it doesn't work because the opposition does not work with that. Right? They just say that all drugs are legal now, and we do not care at all about whether we should drop the rate or stay at the same level. So after that, what would we say depends a lot on what government says.
Sure, obviously. But you could probably, like, the assumption is, for this exercise right now, you heard about what the government says, in opening teams at least what they say, and then you try to adjust your own. The best way to do that probably would be that there is probably some areas of tension or conflict in their cases, in the sense that one, for example, says that, look, there's a high drug usage because there's criminal activity and we want to solve that. And then opening opposition says, no, if you're legalizing, it's probably solve that activity much better. And then here, then you have to be probably find a way that to answer that question, why one is better than the other. And here, strategically, you can either go along with the opening opposition's complete case and say that, look, legalization works in these phases and try to extend on that. Or you could say, look, we agree with the opening teams that in this aspect, for example, opening opposition is right, probably legalization would be better. but it's not likely that it's going to happen soon. But why creating Amsterdams is bad for this process. And you can sneak in a new way of looking into the debate and create a timeline that doesn't necessarily contradict the opening opposition's counterpro. Make sense?
Yes, so you do what the second table should do.
Yes, exactly. All right. Let's go to the last point. This house believes that emerging markets should have closer economics and political relations with East over West. This is emerging markets. I mean, it could be Turkey, it could be, I don't know, another country in this whole region. It could be Kazakhstan. It could be, for example, countries that in the Balkans. It could be like different countries. It doesn't really matter as much because it's just emerging markets. That means they're developing countries, but they're not developed yet, right? Okay. And what does it say? Have closer economics and political relations with East or West. So in the government, you want to have a closer relations with the East. In the opposition, you want to have a closer relations with the West. Think about, for example, like Ukraine. Do you want to have a closer relations, for example, with Russia or with EU? Or think about Turkey. Does Turkey want to have a closer relations with EU or Russia? Or China? Yeah? Okay. And here, obviously, since this is such a broad debate, strategically during the debate, you can talk about many things. You can talk about many countries, their specific problems, and everything. But that's probably not helpful. Why? Because the reason this motion is given such a vague way, it actually begs the following question. There needs to be universal reasons and general reasons why one is better than the other, and vice versa. And you need to try to find things. What is intrinsically good about East, and what is intrinsically good about West? For example, one of the differences is probably in terms of representation. In the West, you probably have much more political influence as an average citizen versus in the East. This doesn't necessarily mean good or bad, because you have more influence and you could probably have negative policies or some kind of policies that harms people, or you have less influence but your government is very good, very effective, and you live very good life, right? Like you could give the example of Singapore, you could give the example of many good countries, economically very well developed, but are not necessarily representative in the sense that we are used to say it in the West, for it, right? Okay, and then your strategy should be here, then not necessarily have an example tennis. Okay, here is why China is bad, here is why US is bad, here is that, and stuff like that. Avoiding that and try to actually find a general place where you can talk about those things. Why elections by itself is something actually difficult for you to have long-term political relations. Look at US, right? Now you use the example to make your point. Say, look, every 4 years, president changes, and sometimes they actually go to the opposite political party, and they basically undo everything that has been done. Look at Trump, what the relations he did with Iran, what he did the relations with, for example, China, what he did relations with European Union, and compare that to Obama. And then try to put yourself in the emerging economy, emerging country, and then would you rather have an ally that might change in 4 years completely and not necessarily benefit you, compared to a Putin that is going to be in power probably until he dies. But there's so much money involved in it, and then there's so much actually political and prestige that is coming with those kind of organizing those events, right? You could talk about that. You could talk about the other sports that they never take enough media attention, right? Because we all talk about football. What about golf? What about swimming? What about other sports that, that is equally valuable, but not necessarily have access to, because your neighborhood municipality only has a football field, and they don't open up a swimming pool because mass commercialization of football and that being the most important, sport. Fifth, you can talk about media, the media coverage, why they always talk about one or another, stuff like that. There are so many points that you can talk about, and here, I think they are all equally valid points. You could see that these ideas are coming to me, oh my god, they are all so good, but I only have 7 minutes. What do? I have to pick and choose somehow. And if I'm in the opening government, I am free, basically. right? Like I have all these open field, I can choose. But I also need to make sure whatever I left belong won't be used by the closing government. For example, if I'm talking about like the issues about politics and about the women and feminism and all those ideas, like identity politics and politics in general, and not really talk about the other things, then I have to make it sound less important so that the closing government cannot come up and use those things. Or vice versa. I'm talking about why football is the main sport. That means there are less sports available. That means less choice. It's a bad thing. Then I have to make sure that the closing government doesn't use this whole Qatar, the politics, and the women representation points. And then I have to show somehow in my speech, if I'm opening government, that look, these points are less important because obviously, whatever, if we have more sports, this doesn't automatically change the women. This doesn't necessarily change the political affiliations of interests of the countries. They will still exist in both sides of the house. But here are the specific problems, like stuff like that. So you have to not only prioritize, but also make sure what you deprioritize is not taken away by some other team and then used, because then the judges, it's up to the judges then, which one is more developed, which one is more convincing. Because they are not automatically better than another if you just leave it in if they're equally analyzed, how do I choose? We'll see, whichever is more persuasive. But you can make sure that one is less likely to be chosen by making sure that it sounds less important. Yeah? Okay, let's go to the last slide. How to win from closing half. So this is obviously, even this topic by itself is a workshop that we can talk about for an hour. But that's not something I'm going to do because I have to leave the stage soon and then Ilya has to come here and continue this point. But before I finalize this, I just want to give you some ideas, at least that you can think about, and then maybe you can follow up with me later on if you have further questions about this, and then we can talk about it in more detail, okay? So, best thing to do is be a judge. Be a judge means that actually try to see the debate as it's happening and then try to have a comment on it. For example, you are closing government and you're the whip speaker or you're the extension speaker. Doesn't matter as much. Then obviously opening government is telling certain things and opening opposition telling some other things. And they are having a discussion, right? And then if you're a judge, you must know, once the opening half is over, which team beat the another team. That's what a good judge does. They don't wait until the end of the debate to make a decision. When the debate is going along, you have to make certain decisions. And you are obviously persuaded over one team over another, right? So that means if you can find that point where you're more convinced, and if it's on the opposition side, on the opposition side, then you need to tackle that point in order to win over opening government. Does that make sense? So being a judge means that you somehow fill the holes that is happening in the debate and by using your speech. And that judges really like that. That means that you are engaging with the debate. You are not just coming here with the materials that you prepared in 15 minutes, but you're actually engaging and telling me what was important in this debate so far and why you should be the team that wins over others. Okay? Second point, framing is crucial. So framing is always used, you need to frame it, framing is very important in order to win. But what is framing? Framing is basically telling what is the most important thing about this debate, or what are the specific things you want to talk about. But you do it in a way that, look, let's come to the topic about mass commercialization of football. Opening government talked about those things about women's rights and the politics and everything. You are closing government. First thing you should do is tell the judges with your frame what you're gonna tell, which is basically not having enough other sports, not having freedom of choice, is the most important thing. And how do you do that? There are obviously multiple ways of doing it. You just have to say that, and this is the most important thing. That's why we are winning over the other teams. That's basically the framing is. Finding the difference between you and the opening teams, and then pointing out that difference without contradicting. Okay? I'm almost done. And then, Compare and contrast. Compare and contrast, we talked about it, for example, when we were mentioning some examples, like if you were to have more money, then you could use this money on this area rather than supporting the other area. Obviously, by itself, this is not an argument. You have to compare the impacts of this and why one impact is more important than the other. For example, supporting, as an Iran, supporting a terrorist group has an impact, and this impact is less important than spending your money on your domestic people, and here are the reasons why. Okay. Fourth, hedging. What does hedging mean? Hedging means that securing yourself. That you don't put all your eggs into one basket, but rather you distribute them. So there are certain debates that you are not sure how the judge will see the debate. You are not sure. It could go one way or another. And what you need to do is, even if you can say that, look, opposition told this, and you think it's irrelevant, like you think it's out of the debate, that's crazy. But judge is somehow nodding, like, and what should you do? You should say, look, this point is irrelevant, but even if it wasn't, here is the response. Or this point is less important, but it's not true. But even if it is true, here are the reasons why it's not valid or why it's not the best thing to do. So you have to hedge in the sense that you have to give an answer, assuming that point is well taken by the judge. Obviously, you can't do it for every single point, but you have to pay attention what other teams' biggest points are, and try to give those answers with a hedging, with even if. Okay? And last point, look at the assumptions. We talked about assumptions during this workshop sometimes. We said that the governments, myself, for example, the governments in Italy, the central government would be less corrupt. We had this assumption, right? And based on that, we had certain results. We said that, look, it will be probably easier if we centralize it because then there will be less mafia, less corruption, less those regional problems. But obviously the assumption is that the central government is better than the regional ones. Here, as a team, on the other side, you need to point out the judges. Here's, okay, their argument is fine, but they assume that those governments are not corrupt at all. And here are reasons why they could be, or why they are. And then you need to tackle that point that way. And this is a way of actually not only winning in the closing half, but even if you're in the opening half, this is a strategy that you can use. So none of these things are exclusively about closing half. But it especially helps in closing half when you're struggling to find extension, when you're struggling to find an example or a point. Just try to go back to the speech. Be a judge. Look at your notes and what the other team said, and try to compare and contrast them. And try to hedge yourself when you're making this rebuttal. And then try to actually show the assumptions those arguments are relying on, and then tackle those points. Make sense? Any questions and comments? Thank you so much for listening. And if you do have any questions or any comments, please do approach me over the weekend. I'm at your service, and probably
mistakes that people make in the case building and how to avoid